I'm Hamish. Hello and welcome everybody to the first webinar of the Cisema webinar series for 2022 on NMPA registration of medical devices and IVDs in China. I'm Hamish.
And I'm Jackie. Today
we also have Ning here in the middle as well. Jackie, go ahead.
So today we will present on the new CER requirements for China registration of medical devices and IVD.
So a little bit of housekeeping first up. We will speak for around 50 minutes, allowing for 10 minutes specifically for Q&A at the end. But we would like to make this as interactive as we can. So please post your questions as they come to you in the chat box, and we will try to address them at the time. Or there's also a function, and we're just trying this out, where you may request to speak if you have a particular comment that you would like to add. That would be great, because the more interaction and the more interactive this can be, the better. We will send you a replay link in the week following the presentation. And if you would like a copy of the slides, please do reach out by email and we will send them to you.
First, we would like to introduce Cisema to you. Cisema stands for China Service Management, and we are a regulatory affairs consultant and CRO for China. We were founded in 2002 in Munich, Germany, and Beijing, China, by a former Siemens engineer. We now have 12 offices worldwide with nearly 100 employees, most of those on the ground in China. Please sign up to our monthly newsletter on China certification, which you can do on our website.
So a little bit more about us. Ning, would you like to tell everyone who you are and a bit more about yourself? And you might be on mute there, Ning.
Hello to everybody. Thank you very much for handing over to me, Hamish. And my name is Guo Ning, and I'm the general manager of Cisema Beijing, which has been founded in 2003 from Mr. Stefan Fischer, who is the founder of Cisema Group. And I have joined Cisema Beijing since 2008. And have been working in the field of medical device and the pharmaceutical registration here in China since more than 13 years. Thank you, Hamish.
Thanks, Ning. So Ning is our real technical specialist who will be supplementing, our insights today. So I'm Hamish. I'm COO at Cisema. I'm a lawyer by training, and I'm admitted in New South Wales, Australia, as well as Hong Kong, which has been my home for the last 6 years. I formerly worked with UK Magic Circle firm Regulators.
And I'm Jackie. I've been with Cisema since 2019. I studied my bachelor's in Canada and previously worked in Bureau Veritas that specialized in testing, inspection, and certification, and also in Yahoo, where I had the opportunity to work with their global team in digital tech. Now I am the Cisema lead to support Hong Kong and China regulatory affairs for our customers from Taiwan and Hong Kong.
Okay, so here is a bit of an agenda. If we have time, we'll get through all these topics today, just looking at some definitions, first of all, and some regulatory framework, as well as recent registration trends, before we look at some overview decision trees, or rather some overview clinical pathways, and then some more specific decision trees about clinical evaluation reports for China. We'll look at clinical trial requirements as well, before we go into some more detail about the CER outline for Class 1 products, for exempted products, and we'll talk a little bit about IVD as well. Thank you as always for listening. It's a great audience we have. And so it's a pleasure to continue our Cisema webinar series. And Jackie, let's begin.
Yep. In this slide, we have extracted some statistics from the NMPA's annual report on MD and IVD registrations. Applications accepted here are shown in blue and successful approvals in yellow. You can see that there was a large fall in 2017. The dip of registration numbers in 2017 and 2018 was caused by a change in law and testing requirements. In fact, the NMPA sought to make local testing free, but the test labs refused to comply. So eventually, a compromise was reached whereby testing centers can still charge for an accelerated test. Of course, if you apply for the no-fee test, you will be put to the back of the queue and unlikely ever to get tested at all. You can see from the trend in numbers that ever since 2018, there has been a significant increase in number of registrations. In 2021, a total of 12,255 applications were accepted by the NMPA for review. 11,314 approvals were granted for the Chinese market, covering 1,710 initial registration, 6,939 registration renewals, and 2,665 changes in licensing items, of which 4,596 applications were for domestic class 3 devices. 3,069 applications were for overseas class 3 devices, and 3,649 applications were for overseas class 2 devices. The total number of approvals increased by 14.9% in comparison with the previous year. Roughly 1/3 of the registration are IVDs and 2/3 are medical devices.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. We have, I think Nicole is, we had a request to ask a question there. Is that right from Nicole? I'm not sure if I'm looking at this function correctly. Anyway, that's fine. But if you do have any questions at any time, yeah, please do ask them. Not sure if I think I've clicked the right button. Anyway, let's continue.
So also of interest is the class or the largest number of foreign product groups registered in China. China continues to focus on the supply of high-end, high-cost medical devices from abroad. The 5 class 2 and 3 product groups of foreign origin to be registered in 2021 were the same as in 2020, but a slight change in order, with medical imaging equipment coming first with 70 registrations, passive implants devices in the second place with 50 registrations, dental instruments as third with 41 registrations, and neurological and cardiovascular surgical instruments with 36 registrations, followed by ophthalmic devices with 33 registrations. As seen in this slide, the top registering countries with US as the top, and it has been for a number of years now. Germany, Japan, and South Korea were 2, 3, and 4 respectively. Also listed on the slide some of the other top 10 countries. On this slide, you see a number of examples of the related regulations for CER listed out in 4 different levels. In blue, the Order 739 was first announced in March 2021 by the China State Council. In yellow, the SAMR Decree number 47 was published in August 2021 to be effective from October 1st, 2021 onwards. In September 2021, as seen in the lighter gray box, the NMPA published the clinical trial exemption list for medical devices in accordance with the Order 47. Early the number in 2021, and the NIFDC announced a list of 181 GB and YY standards that were issued in 2021. Both lists cover regulations and guidance notes that help to support and further implement the Order 739 framework for medical devices in China. The codename of the mandatory national standards is GB, and the recommended national standards is GBT. The codename of the mandatory industry standards is YY, and the codename of the recommended industry standards is YYT. In general, the regulator in China would publish a draft version of the regulation first to solicit comments, which may be followed by a second draft. Otherwise, the finalized regulation would be published with the implementation date announced, as well as the duration of the transitional period that could be up to a year for the regulation to become effective. In some cases, a trial version would be published instead that would be reviewed upon by the China regulator to determine the effectiveness of the regulation. So
now we're just going to have a look at a few definitions from NMPA, which may align with the terminology you're used to already. But for clinical data, the definition used is that safety, clinical performance, and/or efficacy information generated during the clinical use of a medical device. The sources of clinical data are set out here on the slide, can be pre- and post-market clinical trial data of the subject or predicate device, and published or unpublished clinical experience data of the subject or predicate device. Other clinical experience data can also be used. The clinical evaluation itself is use of the scientific method to analyze and evaluate clinical data to confirm the safety, clinical performance, and effectiveness of the device. Importantly, the clinical evaluation is carried out by the manufacturer to demonstrate conformity to principles of safety and performance. And the result, of course, of the clinical evaluation is the clinical evaluation report, or the CER. This is provided to the NMPA, the regulatory authority, for review. The CER elaborates on the clinical data and its quality to demonstrate conformity, as we've said, and a recent change is that it does need to be updated continuously, in fact, more in line with European requirements. So after the product is approved, the applicant needs to routinely monitor product safety, performance, and effectiveness information, and reevaluate risks and benefits based on the updated information. So what does the clinical pathway to write or to determine what clinical evaluation is required for your medical device in China? It depends, first of all, on the risk class. As you can see set out on the slide, there's a fairly clear distinction between class 1 products and class 2 and 3 products. Actually, class 2 and 3 products generally have a similar pathway, whereas class 1 follows much more simplified procedure. And in fact, class 1 products are generally exempt from the need to provide a clinical evaluation report. Class 2 and 3 products either can be listed on a clinical trial exemption list, in which case that product category does not require clinical trials in China, so that's clear. Or it can be listed on a slightly new concept of a clinical evaluation exemption, which means that a CER is not necessary either, and a simplified equivalence analysis is required to determine that the product is equivalent to the exemption category. Otherwise, a clinical evaluation is required. Either that can be done on the basis of equivalency of a predicate device, and in which case the CER is, of course, fundamental, and it's drafted according to the recent circular release of last year. Previously, there was another guidance that had been in force for the last 6 years. Or if a predicate device comparison or evaluation is not possible or not feasible in the circumstances due to lack of data or otherwise, a clinical trial will be necessary. Either that clinical trial can be conducted overseas, i.e. in your home jurisdiction, or it must be done locally in China. The local China clinical trial may be a more reduced bridging trial, or it may be a full clinical trial. If so, you will also need to draft a CER as well as the clinical trial report to submit and have your product approved for registration and sales in China. So we're going to dive into this in a little bit more detail. This is the general overview and the framework as we move through. So going into a bit more detail here, as we set out the class 1 product, it's relatively straightforward. It submits an exempt CER. Class 2 and 3, the first question is really, is the product on the clinical trial exemption list? If the answer is yes, then it's straightforward. The simplified clinical evaluation report will be sufficient. If it's not, then you ask, is it CER exempt? This, as I mentioned, is a relatively new requirement. If it is on the CER exemption list, then It's also straightforward. You don't need to provide a CER. If it's not, then we go into a more detailed analysis, which we're going to dive into in a moment. Ning, is there anything else that that is worthwhile saying before we move on to some of the more detail for this slide?
Not from my side. We can move to the next slide.
Okay. So this is the more busy and more detailed slide, and this is actually a decision tree from NMPA itself about clinical trial requirements. I'm going to ask Ning to take us through this in a bit more detail, and don't worry if it looks a little bit small, because we will break out each of these key sections for you before we round up and show the whole picture again. Ning, please, could you take us through the detail here for this decision tree from NMPA about clinical trials?
Yeah, thank you, Hamish. I take over. And this is an official decision tree from NMPA to illustrate the different scenarios and possibilities to write a CER, clinical evaluation report, in order to avoid clinical trial in China. And you can split this decision tree in the middle, and you can, yes. And now you can see there are two parts here: the left part, right part. And before 2021, there was only the left part of the scenarios were possible. And after 2021, with a new regulation, the right part, the different scenarios in the right part become realistic, become a new possibilities, new pathways to write CER for high-risk medical device. And as you can see, we have a marked high-risk medical device in blue here, because it's the first question you have to ask yourself: if your medical device is high risk or not. What means high risk in China? There is a specific high risk class 3 medical device list issued by NMPA, and has been updated also by NMPA in 2021. And all products, all devices which have been listed in this list are defined as high risk by NMPA in China. So if your device is in the list, in the high risk list, then previously you have no other choice but to do clinical trial in China before 2021. But now with new regulation, you still get a new chance, new possibility to write a CER to avoid clinical trial, which is also one of the main difference between the old and new regulation in the field of clinical evaluation since 2021. Yeah, so let's look at the left part in more details. So if it is in the left part, which means your device is not a high-risk medical device, no. So this is a general precondition for the different scenarios in the left side. And then the next question you have to ask yourself is that, is my device new in China? New means if there is any other similar devices have been registered and sold in China, approved in China, from the perspective of function, claim, intended use, technology, if there's anything in these perspectives, if there is anything new which has never been seen in China before with my device, if the answer is no, then it's pretty straightforward. It's very simple for you to write a CER, a simplified CER, to avoid clinical trial. So it means if your device is neither high risk nor new, then it's very simple for you to write CER. But if the answer to the new medical device is yes, then you have to prepare more non-clinical and clinical data to prove the safety and efficacy of especially of the new functions, of new intended use, new technology of your device in China, to convince NMPA that an additional clinical trial in China is not necessary. So this is in principle the left part, which illustrates the different possibilities to avoid clinical trial if your device is not high risk. Move ahead, please. And then we move to the right part, which is a much more difficult part than the left part, and which is also new possibility since 2021. The right part means your device is high risk, is in the high risk list of NMPA. Then you have to ask several questions. You have to find out several facts at first. Firstly, if there's any predecessor product, if you have any predecessor product, normally you have predecessor product as a manufacturer. And if there's no predecessor product, you have to collect more convincing clinical data of the declared product to convince NMPA. There is still a chance to convince NMPA, but the chance is smaller than there is a predecessor product. And if you have a predecessor product, the next question is if your predecessor product has been approved and marketed in China, and if it has been approved and marketed in China, then it's simpler for you to write a CER, because then you can prove to NMPA that the predecessor product has already been registered here in China, approved by you, NMPA, and we have sold it, we have used it in the Chinese hospitals, we have collected a lot of useful real-world data, patient cases, and so on. We have a lot of Chinese patient data, and with this data, you can convince NMPA that your current product is also safe. And if the predecessor product is not approved in China, then you have to provide more data, including the declared product and predecessor product overseas, to demonstrate that your product is safe. But there's always a possibility to avoid NMPA according to the new regulation in 2021. But this right part is much more difficult than the left part, because the left part we have discussed, I have presented was established method in China. But this right part is new, and even NMPA has no experience with reviewing such kind of approach and the documents and so on. So they also need practice, and the applicants, the manufacturers need more practice, and so the risk is much higher than the left part approach. Okay.
Yeah, and just here's the overview. Here's the overview again, just to see how it looks in total. Yes. One question we've received from Michael. He's asked about guidance from regulators before choosing a clinical pathway. I think it's helpful to address that now. Actually, how would you respond to that question? Can we get guidance from NMPA before proceeding?
You can only get a rough guidance from NMPA. You can make an appointment with an NMPA reviewer officially, but there are two problems. One problem is that the reviewer will not give you a definite answer to your questions. He or she will only tell you what is regulation to your points, but your answer will not be directly answered. Your question will not be directly answered, and also their answer are not, are not legal, are not binding. Yes, and are not binding. And the second problem is that after you submit it, you will submit your application dossier to NMPA afterwards, maybe 1 year or even 2 years after the consultation. Nobody knows who is going to be in charge to review your dossier, especially your clinical evaluation report. So the chance that the same person you have consulted 1 year, 2 years ago will review your dossier is very, very, very small. So these are two problems.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's very helpful.
Okay.
And, we've also received a question from Dr. Teal about English translations. No is the short answer. There's no readily available English translation of any of the Chinese regulations. It is only published in Chinese. Unofficial translations are possible. And if you'd like to know more, please get in touch. Okay, thank you so much, Ning, for walking through that in detail. Jackie, could you tell us a little bit more about Class 1 clinical evaluation?
Yep. So clinical evaluation reports are required for all medical devices in Europe. In contrast, clinical evaluation reports are not required for Class 1 medical devices in China. However, Class 1 medical devices will still need to show basic clinical evaluation. The content for which is set out in this slide describe in detail the intended use of the product, describe in detail the intended usage environment of the product, describe in detail the target audience, the product indications, comparison of the clinical use of similar products that are already on the market in China, and description of the adverse events of similar products. So on September 18th of 2021, the NMPA published the clinical trial exemption list for medical devices and IVDs in accordance with the Order 47 and Order 48, respectively, which, as mentioned, became effective on October 1st, 2021. The clinical trial exemption list now cover 1,010 medical devices and 423 IVDs as listed on the slide. A total of 423 products were exempted from clinical trials in this catalog, including 2 product categories of Class 3 in vitro testing reagents and 11 product categories of Class 2 in vitro testing reagents. Comparing to the previous catalog released in December 2019, 7 newly added products include Class 3 products such as some antibody test reagents and also lead test reagents as Class 2 products. The clinical trial exemption list for IVD reagents do not cover self-testing or newborn testing related products. The following Class 2 IVD reagents are accepted from clinical trials, which includes flow cytometric analysis reagents and custom reagents. According to the Order 739, clinical trials can be exempted if the safety and effectiveness of medical devices can be proven by other non-clinical evaluation studies, such as existing clinical data of predicate devices in the market, clinical evaluation, etc. In August of 2021, Order 47 and 48 further specified that applicants, they should ensure the intended use of predicate devices that remains unchanged, while no serious adverse events have occurred in the past, in order to use these existing clinical data to apply for NMPA approval. For these products, a grade simplified CER is sufficient upon application.
Yes, Ning, could you provide a bit more flavor here? Well, actually, I guess we're going to go into some more analysis about what that simplified clinical evaluation report looks like. But yeah, Ning, would you be able to provide a bit more detail about this simplified clinical evaluation report and your experience, and what are the key points to look out for?
It's pretty straightforward. You just need to find out similar predicate device which has been approved and sold in China. Then make a comparison in different important technical points, and there's a very clear guideline and template from NMPA is available. So it's pretty straightforward.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, just from me, there's sort of 4 broad sections which are listed here on the slide, including product description, the comparison, as Ning mentioned, both with the catalog itself and the predicate device, as well as your basic analysis and conclusions. The comparisons are generally along the metrics of basic principles, structural composition, manufacturing materials or body contacting materials, performance requirements, disinfection, sterilization methods, intended use, and method of application. And of course, the comparison items can be added to where required. As Ning mentioned, there is a list of high-risk products. Previously, this meant that they must have clinical trial data in order to be approved for China sales. However, now, as Ning has very helpfully explained in detail, this is not a must. So these high-risk products simply go through a more detailed analysis as to whether clinical trial data is required for their application. But it's still important to understand and appreciate the high-risk products themselves, which most recently was updated a couple of years ago or a year and a half ago, and includes cardiac pacemakers, blood pumps, and some other implantables in particular, as well as sort of tissue engineering products and long bone fixation products. So these orthopedic implants, these are seen as high risk, and therefore NMPA has sought to have extra analysis for their approval. Okay, so moving on to one other category, we've talked about class 1 products. We've talked about where the product is clinical trial exempted, and we've talked about high-risk products. The other category to be aware about is where there's overseas clinical trial data available. So this includes for high-risk products, they can also rely on overseas clinical trial data, provided that data satisfies a number of requirements, which we've broadly classified under ethical, legal, and scientific principles. So the ethical principles are relatively well known. The Declaration of Helsinki, of course, as well as collection methods and ethics committee approval. China regulator is quite fastidious in terms of having all the boxes checked, signatures signed properly and dated, etc., etc. So in some ways it goes without saying, but you always need to be quite careful that all your documentation is really properly in order, because the NMPA reviewers go through it in fine detail, and it's an easy sort of query or supplementary notice if there's any of this information missing. In terms of the legal principles, GCP, good clinical practice, is needs compliance, but it's China GCP, or a gap analysis for GCP of your jurisdiction versus China GCP. So that's an important point to be aware of. The protocol, clinical trial protocol itself, will need to be submitted with the registration dossier. For the scientific principles, this is of course that clinical data. The clinical data collected is authentic, scientific, reliable, and traceable, and the clinical trial report itself will need to be submitted with the registration dossier. Ning, is there anything else to say here about acceptance of overseas clinical trial data in terms of what manufacturers should be aware about, or practical tips?
Yeah, as Hamish has indicated, these are most important 3 factors and must be fulfilled for ethical, legal, and scientific requirements of NMPA. And besides these three requirements, the most important thing to take into consideration is the ethical or the risk difference between the people where you have done your overseas clinical trial, the patients you have done your clinical trial, and the Chinese people. So if you are manufacturer in the EU or in the US, then this could be a very important factor to be taken into consideration. Whether there's any significant ethnical difference, and if there is such kind of difference, if you can prove that this difference will not affect the safety and efficacy of your device, which will be used in China. Hamish?
Yeah, thank you, Dean. Very, very good point. So yeah, just to recap, it's ethnic differences are important to address in submission of your overseas clinical trial data, and sometimes that means you need to do a bridging trial in China to support the ethnic differences with your full clinical trial done elsewhere, because yes, this clinical trial requires usually a multi-center clinical trial and substantial case numbers. We have another question about whether Hong Kong is regarded as overseas for overseas clinical trial data. So Hong Kong is an interesting one because it is a separate regulatory framework for medical device and IVD registration. In fact, Hong Kong, as you may be aware, Hong Kong only is a voluntary medical device and IVD framework, so you don't even need to register your product unless, for marketing or sales purposes. For example, you may want to list your product, as it's called, with the Hong Kong MDAX, which is the regulator here, because it allows or is more likely to get you on the public tender. Actually,
Amish, excuse me, may I jump in here?
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
I think the question is addressed to ask whether the clinical trial data collected in Hong Kong or clinical trial made in Hong Kong will be seen by NMPA as overseas clinical data or as a Chinese clinical trial directly. And the answer is simply that they will be seen as overseas clinical data. As you have done the clinical trial in Japan, in Europe, or in the US, is the same thing, because only when you have started the clinical trial by the authorized hospitals in the mainland China, which has been accredited by NMPA. There is a list of such kind of accredited hospitals in the mainland China. Then it will be considered as a clinical trial, valid clinical trial in China. So Hong Kong is overseas clinical data, but the difference to the Western countries is that you don't need to take the ethnicity difference into consideration anymore. So it's one problem fewer.
Thank you. Yeah, there are some subtle differences, of course, for some other product categories, like in drugs. Actually, HKU Hospital does have some NMPA approvals for some drug trials, but yeah, it's quite specific circumstances where this is an exception, and for the purpose of medical devices and IVD, yeah, it's overseas. But Ning makes a really good point that then you do cover off the ethnic difference, so that's important. Okay, I see whether we're running through time because we get too excited about all the different points here, but we still have a few slides to get through, so we'll move on. In terms of the clinical evaluation content itself, Ning, could you please go through briefly the CER evaluation content for class 2 and 3 devices?
Yeah, Hamish, I'm glad to. And so this is a structure and a template issued by NMPA, in fact. And the first chapter is a general product description, including basic information of the product, information of the scope of application, indication, research, R&D, research and development background, working principle, and scientific concepts, and expected clinical effects. Next, please. And then the chapter 2 is about the scope of clinical evaluation. And chapter 3 is about clinical evaluation pathway. So there are at the moment 2 main pathways. The first main pathway is a clinical evaluation part with predicate device comparison. Second pathway is CER with overseas clinical data. And the chapter 4 is analysis and evaluation of clinical data of predicate device, if you have chosen the pathway of predicate device, of course. And chapter 5 is the conclusion. Next.
Thank you. So for IVD, there are some differences because for IVD, actually there is no exemption per se for a clinical, some sort of clinical test in China. We talked about the clinical exemption list. That means that clinical trials, full clinical trials aren't required, but clinical tests will often be required for IVDs in China. And the IVD clinical evaluation guideline has specific formula and requirements, as we've just set out basically on the slide here. There's relevant information like name, contact information, the design of the test, testing process is important, including sample selection, number, and distribution, and test management, which is importantly part of the dossier, evaluation data sheet, and signatures, of course.
And Hamish, I have seen a very interesting question again from Michael Sprangford. So is it possible to get guidance from regulators before choosing a clinical pathway?
Yeah, we did address a bit of that question before, but I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right, Ning. I mean, yeah, that is always an important question that we get asked all the time. I don't know. Is there anything additional that you'd like to say about that point?
Yes, the answer is simply impossible. It's impossible because there's a lot of work behind the answer of how to choose the optimized clinical pathway. This is a lot of huge workload, and it's impossible to for a regulator to answer this question just in 1 hour. That's impossible. And we recommend to do a professional feasibility study before you choose the clinical pathway. And the feasibility study is necessary to find out if a predicate device, there is a predicate device, if there is a qualified predicate device approved in China, if there is a qualified overseas clinical data, which one is optimized, which one is the best pathway for you to choose. Yeah, Hamish?
Yeah, Ning, you touched on a great point, which is our feasibility study report. Yes, and it might be worthwhile just moving forward to that now, because this sets out how we think about the process and how we analyze the data of our customers so that we can give them appropriate advice as to which clinical pathway to take. And we have a couple of steps here that I've set out, really 4 basic steps about the subject product, where we analyze it. First of all, of course, classification is of course very important, because that will help determine the pathway, and then the pathway analysis itself relating to clinical trial decision, the evaluation strategy, and the pathway. Finally, the step 4 is the feasibility of avoiding a clinical trial in China. There's a bit more detail also that I should point to about preparing the CER. There are 3 broad options: the overseas clinical trial data pathway, the predicate device data pathway, which can either be equivalent or a similar medical device, or the real world data pathway, which is which is supplementary information that can be added to write a successful CER. And then we also have a more specific or detailed decision tree around clinical trial and whether or not that's required. Ning, do you have anything more to say here on the clinical trial decision tree or the feasibility study report in general?
Yeah, and firstly, as you have explained, Hamish, firstly we will analyze the declared product, and then we will analyze all three different the feasibility of all three different pathways, and then we will we have developed our methodology to quantify the possibility, the feasibility of writing CER through one of these three pathways, or through the combination of these three pathways. And at last, as a manufacturer, you can get a rating from us, a very exact rating, and then you know exactly what is the best way for you to choose clinical evaluation report or clinical trial in China.
Thank you, Nick.
Hamish? Yeah.
So I want to say a bit more about predicate device. Jackie, and I'm going to ask you to take us through this slide where we go into a bit more detail about how do you select, assuming you want to go to the predicate device route, you don't have overseas clinical trial data. What we're going to go into a bit more detail about the predicate device route in the last 10 or so minutes remaining. Jackie, could you take us through this slide, please? Maybe you're on mute there, Jackie.
Yeah, sorry about that. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah.
So to determine the predicate device, it needs to be NMPA approved. There needs to be one or more multiple devices that are equivalent or similar, and the differences shouldn't impact the safety and effectiveness. You can find potential predicates by checking through the NMPA website or the provincial NMPA website, or by market research. When choosing the predicate device for your China CER, the first requirement is that it must be approved by NMPA in China, as mentioned. Additionally, the predicate device should still be within its validity period. All devices in China must be renewed every 5 years in order not to lose their validity. Equivalency or similarity between predicate and your product must be shown in terms of the structure of your device that is similar to that of the predicate device. The working principle and mechanism of your device and the predicate device should be the same. The intended use of your device and the predicate device should be consistent. The indication of the predicate device should be greater than or equal to the indication of your device. And the important parameters should be consistent. Where there are differences between the predicate and your product, you must provide a difference evaluation to show that there is no effect on the safety and effectiveness.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. And now I just want to show here, this is what the previous comparative study under the old CER guidance looked like. There were 16 broad points along which comparison needed to be made. There were some distinctions depending on whether it was an active or a passive medical device. But there was quite detailed requirements for each. This is the old CER guidance. The new CER guidance has significantly streamlined this and optimized the logic. So now we compare 3 aspects instead of 16, although of course there are subdivisions of each. The 3 aspects are scope of application, technical characteristics, and biological characteristics. This is similar to the EU MDR requirements. We are trying to show that the scope of application is the same between the application and the predicate. This doesn't mean that the indication itself has to be the same, of course. For the patient population, point 2, in our experience, actually, it can be really difficult to find the age or sex limitations in the IFU. Usually it fits for all ages of patients. In the new guidance, we need to explain about the sex and the age for the subject device, which can be a challenge. For other items, the types of contact and duration of use might be included in the technical part, sometimes in the EU MDR as well. The stage and severity of the disease, it's difficult to find, similar to subject and predicate, although maybe the same in your other jurisdictions. For points 6 and 7 here, conditions of use, repeated use, these should be in the IFU. If there's any conflicts, then it needs deep description. Also note especially the contraindication. This can be problematic. The reviewer tends to ask more questions here. And if you don't have enough clinical evidence, you should say it's not fit for this indication so that you don't need to discuss with the reviewer much further. For point 2, technical, this is comparing the design information, energy, and other technical features. As I understand, under EU MDR, you can only choose the same material as the predicate. In China, for orthopedic products, it can be difficult to find the same design and same material as a predicate. And previously, we may have thought to choose 2 predicates, one with a similar design and one with a similar material. So that's one way to move forward there. Biological characteristics. Previously, this wasn't mentioned much. Just state the requirements and follow the standards and regulations, but now you need to go into detail about, for example, the degradation, tissue integration, etc. Just briefly, in the last few minutes, we've got a comparison here of the old guidelines versus new guidelines and EU MDR. State of the art is still, a specifically EU requirement versus China. And so it's important that you don't simply transpose your EU CER to China, because China CER requires the evaluation to specifically satisfy the China requirements. And China requirements are slightly different. Although converging on international harmonization, there are still key differences. So you can't simply transpose your EU requirements. But key points to note are that there are additional supporting documents required, but it is simplified and streamlined in terms of the logic for the equivalence demonstration. And also just in terms of continuous update, that's now more of an emphasis in the new CER guidelines, and there's a broader array of equivalents allowed. So it's not just equivalent, but also more similar products. That's now a greater understanding. We've been through the FSR points, so really we have a few minutes remaining for questions as we look at our final slide, just where we look at some products where we have helped write the CER and on the basis of a predicate, on the basis of previous generation, or on the basis of clinical evidence or overseas clinical trial data. So let's pause there, and we've gone through a lot and it's very detailed. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. I think we can even have you speak, or I see that there are some further questions written in the text chat as well. Thank you, Ning. Thank you, Jackie. I think that's all we have time for today. I hope this has been informative and interesting, and I look forward to connecting with you. If you'd like to ask further questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.